Good morning for those on the East Coast. Good afternoon, good evening for those that might be joining us from overseas. If you're in Washington, I hope you enjoyed the snow yesterday. So today we're going to talk about considerations for IPEF in the new year, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And I'm joined by three amazing speakers who can talk about trade, engagement with the Indo-Pacific, and can offer a variety of opinions and views of what the Biden administration needs to do this year. I'm joined by Barbara Weisel, who is the managing director of Rock Creek Global Advisors. I'm also joined by Marc Mealy, the chief policy officer and senior vice president of research for the US-ASEAN Business Council, and by Bill Reinsch, who's here with us at CSIS as a senior advisor and the Scholl Chair in International Business. I'm very excited to have them join us today about a topic that we're just so excited to talk about. And we're going to give some updates as well as to where the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is. There was a scurry of activity to try to get this done by APEC in November. Pillar 1 ran into some trouble. That's the one that's being negotiated by USTR. And pillars 2 through 4, which is being negotiated by Commerce, were more successful. IPEF has been running into both domestic and international difficulties, but this is one attempt by the Biden administration to make sure that it has a strong economic tie to the region, particularly as it is not part of any regional trade agreement, whether it's RCEP or CPTPP. If anyone has any trouble with acronyms, please let me know. Put a note in the chat. And speaking of the chat, we're going to turn it over to audience Q&A about the halfway point of the hour. So please put your questions in the chat and I will help moderate afterwards. So I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker. Barbara, please go ahead and tell us a bit about IPEF. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Erin, and I appreciate the opportunity to join today and to be here with my friends Marc and Bill. Let me start with some context on where things currently stand and how countries are thinking about IPEF as 2024 begins. And I think with this kind of preface, we can better consider ways to ensure IPEF durability beyond 2024. So let me just go back briefly to the early discussions of the launch of IPEF. As you may recall, other countries were unclear about the initiative, particularly what concrete results would flow from the US proposals, but they ultimately agreed to join IPEF because of a number of reasons. First, they were eager for US engagement in the region. They were open to new areas of negotiation. This was post-COVID, and there were a lot of discussions on supply chain resilience and other issues that they were interested in pursuing. But they recognized trade had become increasingly politicized in the United States. And even though they understood that, they were hoping that the Biden administration ultimately would decide to take up market access as part of the negotiations, as some of the early remarks from administration officials had suggested. And even if there wasn't market access, they assumed that there would be other economic benefits from participation. So they agreed to join. And I think, as you said, Erin, post last year's APEC leaders meeting, when the pillar 1, that is the trade pillar, was not concluded, they have no illusions. You know, at the 11th hour, the Biden administration chose not to conclude the trade pillar, even without the market access components or the core digital trade commitments, because of pushback from many in the Democratic Party who feared trade becoming an issue in the 2024 campaign. And if there needed to be a further reminder of the politicization of trade following APEC and the announcement of conclusion of 3 of the 4 pillars of APEC, Donald Trump said, if elected, he would kill IPEF, which he called TPP2, and worse than the first one, arguing that it would hollow out US manufacturing and turbocharge outsourcing to Asia. So as we enter 2024 and the election year gets underway, US IPEF partners are crystal clear that if the US was unable to include an ambitious trade pillar last year, it is even more unlikely to be able to do that this year. Are they disappointed with that? Of course. Are they going to walk away from negotiations on Pillar 1 or IPEF more broadly? No. US partners continue to want to promote US engagement in the region. And while they'll continue to keep their expectations in check about the economic opportunities that IPEF will provide, they'll give it more time to see if through implementation of the agreement, they can support their efforts or their need to build up supply chain resilience and promote climate transition. So they'll participate this year under the schedule already agreed by the parties for further discussions on implementation of the supply chain pillar, the clean energy pillar, and the fair economy pillar, that is pillars 2, 3, and 4, and further discussions of negotiation of the trade pillar. For the Biden administration, they had made IPEF the marquee Asian trade initiative of the administration. So they're going to need to be able to defend what was achieved. And since the trade pillar is not yet concluded, they'll focus on what was achieved in the other 3 pillars, on specific plans for implementation of the general commitments, the cooperative commitments in the text, and their vision for the agreement going forward. When they do this, they're going to need to respond to questions that some will ask about whether IPEF is simply a political agreement and whether it has anything in it actually worth preserving. The implementation of pillars 2 through 4 over the coming year will provide the administration the opportunity to show that it is, in fact, more than a political agreement, and that it is one with real value for advancing US economic interests and that it should be maintained. With that framing, let me turn to next steps on IPEF and what the administration could do to help ensure durability of the initiative beyond 2024. The US and its IPEF partners may have detailed proposals that they've already developed for doing that, but since we don't know that, and they haven't discussed it publicly, and in fact may still be developing those plans, let me just provide 2 suggestions. First, IPEF members need to lay out their agenda for this year and move quickly to agree on meaningful deliverables in 2024. On supply chains, the 14 countries appear to have agreed to a meeting schedule for standing up the 3 bodies that are to be established under the supply chain pillar, and that is the Supply Chain Council, the Supply Chain Crisis Network, the Labor Rights Advisory Board. But setting up these bodies, just standing them up, should not be the only outcomes for this year. Each of these groups needs to deliver at least one, and preferably more than one, concrete, tangible, and meaningful outcome. I'd like to just focus for a second on Pillar 2, which is the only one that has a text that's been made public so far. And so I'd like to focus on that one for that reason. And it includes many potentially useful elements that the parties said that they intend to pursue. For example, the parties intend to align guidance, procedures, and policies related to trade facilitation to the extent possible, and to share best practices to help enterprises benefit from such guidance, procedures, and policies. But now they need to agree on specifics. Those are very general cooperative commitments. What exactly will they do over the coming year to align those policies and practices? Well, maybe they could work on including certain benefits from their respective trusted trader programs in common approaches to those programs, like reducing the likelihood of customs inspections, enhanced information sharing and exactly what that will entail, giving front of the line inspections rights for companies that are part of those trusted trader programs, and shorter waiting times. They're not going to all have identical trusted trader programs, but they can include the same benefits from participation in those programs. They can work together to develop common standards for inputs to supply chains for critical goods, like semiconductors, batteries, and maybe special preferences to IPEF companies to facilitate intra-IPEF trade of products and services that meet those standards. They have already agreed to establish a crisis response network and to establish emergency communications channel for IPEF partners to seek support during a supply chain disruption and to facilitate information sharing and collaboration. Again, this is potentially useful, but what will that actually entail? They're going to need to define what exactly are economic and political criteria to determine when a supply chain shock is actually taking place. And then they need to agree on what kind of information sharing they will do with one another. And that's going to require support from the private sector, which is going to need to provide that information. Sharing information may help provide some early warnings, but they're also going to need agreement on specific actions they would take to respond to disruptions. All of this will be very complicated, but at a minimum, they should be able to agree on customs procedures to facilitate free movement of critical goods during supply chain shocks. The IPEF countries also agreed to create an IPEF critical minerals dialogue that's tasked with building stable critical mineral supply chains. And there's a lot of other proposals that were part of the announcement, but no details. So it's unclear what specific outcomes this dialogue is intended to produce. They're going to need to move quickly to identify specific goals and plans to achieve them this year. If negotiation of critical minerals agreements are off the table for now, they should look at promoting long-term offtake agreements to supply newer expanded national critical minerals reserves. And maybe they can look at financing through development agencies in IPEF countries and multilateral development institutions, but conditioned on agreement to refrain from restricting exports to IPEF countries of critical minerals or from participating in a cartel to control prices. They can help develop common minimum standards for the extraction, processing, and recycling of critical minerals. And there are more suggestions like this, but I think the point is that they need to come up with very specific outcomes that these groups that they're standing up will produce. And just before I close, let me just turn to a second suggestion briefly, which is more about process than outcomes. And that is that IPEF countries should establish a new government stakeholder set of working groups alongside government-to-government meetings. IPEF is not like a trade agreement that governments negotiate with one another. The success of IPEF depends very heavily on cooperation from the business community, including on information sharing and what information the governments will have at their disposal to share, for financing of new projects and infrastructure with the governments, which the governments can't do on their own, and for reorienting supply chains. So having more consistent interaction and deeper stakeholder engagement with governments and other stakeholders involved as well would accelerate the ability of governments to focus on meaningful proposals and then to coordinate with the key stakeholders that are going to be required to deliver concrete, meaningful, and enduring IPEF outcomes this year. And I'm going to stop there in the interest of time, but thanks again, and I look forward to the discussion.
Many thanks, Barbara, for your comments. For any U.S. government officials that are on here or those that engage with any of the IPEF members, there's always this drive to come up with deliverables. And I think Barbara outlined very good, very clear and coherent, actionable deliverables, or at least a pathway forward. So if you're listening, I think there were some great ideas here, but I know that going into this, and especially in an election year, for half the globe, and with Trump's win in Iowa just the other day, I think, when we think of IPEF and his declaration of tearing up TPP2, it does kind of bring about a little bit more of a negative feeling about whether or not this goes forward and if it's durable. But Barbara, I think you pointed out what some of the successes are, especially in pillars 2, and things to build on that are important to both parties. Market access, we can kind of sort of wistfully think that might happen, but in terms of supply chains and critical minerals, these are certainly bipartisan issues, but also among the IPEF members. So there is some progress to work on. Whether or not it's called IPEF going forward, we shall see. But thank you for those comments. Marc, I'm going to turn over to you with your US-ASEAN Business Council hat. You certainly engage with these IPEF countries directly, and I'd love to hear some of your views and input on this. Thank you. Over to you.
Great. Thank you, Erin, and Happy New Year to all. It's great to spend time with this kind of conversation very early in 2024. Looking at IPEF, and as you mentioned, sort of through the lens of the countries of Southeast Asia, of ASEAN. And as you all know, 7 of the 10 ASEAN member states are full participants in the IPEF process. So in some ways, there's a strong US-ASEAN dimension to IPEF, even though IPEF is not a US-ASEAN kind of framework or engagement. I think from the outset, and just kind of to build on some of the observations that my good friend Barbara offered, I think it's important to really highlight the fact that the ASEAN member states that are part of IPEF, are fully engaged, definitely welcome the initiative, probably as their second best method or approach to deepening U.S. engagement in some of the initiatives that are influencing sort of Asia's regional trade architecture. Obviously, we all know the majority of IPEF members, their first choice would have been for America to sort of rejoin the CPTPP. But in the absence of that, their second best option, again, was perceived as being involved in the IPEF process. So again, I think from that starting point, expectations probably measured from the outset. And as you all know, lots of back and forth between a desire to have market access included, but then realizing that wasn't going to be on the table. Okay, we can still think there can be benefits and value of the engagement. And I think, as you indicated, Barbara, the success around the completion of the talks around Pillar 2, supply chains, very important, because obviously for a number of ASEAN member states, the evolution of supply chains in Asia does matter as countries in the region navigate sort of both the challenges, but also the opportunities associated with sort of the evolution of the US-China relationship. And therefore, being part of a discourse around supply chain resilience and evolution from an economic commercial opportunity perspective, I think does matter. I think pillars 3 and 4, which again, announced that obviously there's been some conclusion, although we haven't seen the text. Also, I think from the ASEAN perspective, does potentially offer some opportunity, particularly on Pillar 3. We know that many countries in Asia, and particularly in Southeast Asia, are at various stages of, quote unquote, their national energy transition journeys. And if Pillar 3 of IPEF can offer opportunities, particularly from a commercial investment perspective, that dovetail with what countries are trying to do in the region, I think there's, again, a degree of potential, of optimism that IPEF can produce some tangible opportunities going forward. As I've been thinking about like what can really make a difference over the next 12 months and maybe 24 months for the role of IPEF in the broader context of U.S. economic engagement. Obviously, again, I'm assuming that 2024, we will see the actual signing of the text for Pillars 3 and Pillar 4. So obviously getting that done would be quite significant to ensure that, again, the potential for IPEF to kind of live on, even if a certain candidate does become president on January 1 of 2025. Obviously, as Barbara mentioned, the execution of the activities around the Labor Rights Advisory Board, the Supply Chain Council, all those kinds of things need to see those kind of things happen. And I agree with you, Barbara. It shouldn't just be events that happen. Those events that happen have to produce tangible outcomes from those activities. Obviously, if there's one assumes there's going to be ministerial events in 2024. Our organization is actually very keen on if there's going to be an IPEF ministerial held in the United States this year, we're actually looking to develop a complementary activity that would play in around such an IPEF ministerial held in the United States in 2024, where in a nutshell, we'd like to create a supplemental activity for 6 or the 7 of the ASEAN trade ministers that would be attending that IPEF ministerial and use that as an opportunity to promote US-ASEAN deeper engagement this year. So that's something that we're thinking about. Let me now turn to, again, a couple of other things that I think that could be helpful from, again, the Southeast Asian perspective. We did really, I think, acknowledge the fact that, towards the APEC summit, there was this agreement to talk about quote unquote critical minerals in 2024 under IPEF. Hindsight being 2020, we know that the government of Indonesia actually proposed such a discussion, I don't know, 10 to 12 months before that. At that time, that proposal wasn't really taken up. So in some ways, we kind of lost maybe a year for that conversation to have happened. But nonetheless, I think that is hopefully a good opportunity going forward that these conversations will be taking place. As I mentioned before, again, Pillar 2, again, seeing some of the actual activities that would come out, seeing some of the tangible results will be very relevant there. And I also think, this year could be an opportunity for some of the ASEAN member states that are participating to once again tee up some of their ideas for what could be tangible, commercially relevant opportunities to be part of the process. And again, I'm hopeful that IPEF member governments, and including our own government, will be open to some of the recommendations and ideas that ASEAN member states will tee up. I would close by saying, 2 things. Number one, in addition to the IPEF engagement, there are going to be, I think, a lot of other sort of non-IPEF related opportunities for engagement this year that both the USG and the US business community are very much involved in. For example, I could just highlight there's going to be, again, US government, US business engagement with ASEAN around workshops on EV ecosystem standards in ASEAN. There's going to be US government, US business jointly working around digital conformity assessment standards around AI and cloud and cybersecurity standards in ASEAN. We've already seen, for example, and I think we're excited about the potential for the US government using some of the ITSE funding to promote semiconductor ecosystem development in places like Vietnam and Indonesia in 2024. The presidential business mission to the Philippines that Secretary Raimondo is going to lead in March, I think is going to be a good opportunity. The Indo-Pacific Business Forum event is going to be a good opportunity, again, that will happen also in the Philippines in May of this year, I think. So there will be a lot of other non-IPEF related kinds of activities that I think, again, will offer opportunities for engagement that hopefully tangentially will also be supportive of what the IPEF sort of game plan kind of looks like. But I also think it's important to keep in mind that as these things play themselves out in the course of this year, the countries in Southeast Asia, and I would say in many other IPEF member states, also have a very active trade policy dance card of their own in the course of this year, in addition to whatever happens along the IPEF journey. I can just mention a couple of things that I can tell you from the ASEAN perspective. Number one, ASEAN beginning the negotiation journey on developing their digital regional economic framework agreement, the DEFA, is going to be one of their top trade policy priorities over the next 12 to 24 months. Second one, the ongoing negotiations that ASEAN's involved in terms of upgrading the ASEAN-China free trade agreement is going to be a big priority this year, again, for ASEAN negotiators. I know there's going to be efforts this year also within ASEAN to both upgrade within their own journey to building the ASEAN economic community. There's going to be efforts to upgrade the ASEAN trade in goods framework to further address non-tariff barriers. Again, always a continuing work in progress, but that's going to be something that will continue. We do know, sitting out there, maybe not as an immediate priority, the ongoing negotiations between ASEAN and Canada for their own free trade agreement will continue. And there's also various negotiations on a bilateral basis amongst a number of ASEAN member states that are also part of IPEF to both upgrade as well as implement some of their bilateral free trade agreements. And those will be things that will also be on their agendas for 2024. So it's going to be a busy dance card for these governments. Again, I'm sure they'll continue to play active roles in the IPEF context, but as we've always kind of thought, in a very competitive environment, in a landscape that has a lot of initiatives and frameworks going on, at the end of the day, IPEF is going to have to produce concrete, tangible, and commercially relevant results in order, I think, to really maintain the bandwidth and interest of our partners in the IPEF context, particularly in Southeast Asia this year. So I'll pause there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mark. You know, it seems like everyone's doing something related to trade except for the United States, so that's good to see. But you know, you make some good points and some interesting points. I mean, even talking about ASEAN work on digital trade, that was certainly one of the key issues around Pillar 1 and domestically. So, you know, there's other agreements out there, whether it's with ASEAN or the USMCA or other agreements where digital trade is a part of this. I mean, this is an important step forward, but certainly not something that we have to build from scratch. But I am concerned that if we don't have IPEF, then we're just kind of like Charlie Brown and getting the football pulled out from under for ASEAN. I'm really bad at metaphors. I don't even know why I try here, but you know what I'm trying to go for. But it's we come with these big initiatives and then end up dropping them in the end. But there are other things happening. A lot of work on Pillar 3. I know this administration is really focused on energy transitions, particularly with Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines. So whether that's on the IPEF framework or not. But thank you, Mark, for your comments. I should have put this as a positive sandwich and have Barbara go first, Mark go last, and maybe Bill in the middle. But we're going to have Bill rocket us back to earth and talk about IPEF and his views on the durability, the future, and what this means for the United States and IPEF signatories. So Bill, I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Erin. It's a pleasure to be with you, particularly with Barbara and Mark, who said all the good things and the important things. There's really not very much left for me to say. And I'm going to be a little bit cranky, unlike the other two, but that's sort of my personality. I think I can't help but look at this as largely a political exercise, and maybe that's because of the 20 years I spent on congressional staff looking at things politically. I think the administration made a decision early on, even before they won in 2020, that they simply didn't want to have any intra-party battles amongst Democrats over trade policy. They had one in 2016 on TPP, which we all remember, which was not a happy experience for anybody. The people who were making the decisions in the White House were part of that, and I think they simply wanted to avoid it. I mean, that led them to IPEF. They had to do something because they were all simultaneously being told that they needed to have an Asian economic policy, and they didn't have one. This is what they came up with. And I think it was a genuine effort to come up with something that would avoid the really bitter fight that they had over TPP. The irony, of course, is you've still got people like Trump saying this is, you know, TPP in disguise, or TPP 2.0, which is ridiculous because it's far from what TPP ever was going to be. But it shows you how sensitive an issue that was. And so they made what I think was a political decision on these issues. And then spent a good bit of time in 2022 and 2023 conducting a narrative to justify the political decision. And the narrative was, we're going to have a trade policy for the workers, we're going to have a trade policy for the middle class, and we're going to have a trade policy that pays attention to workers and make sure the benefits of the agreement accrue to workers and not to big companies and their executives. And the irony, of course, with IPEF, particularly with Pillar 1, is that they were basically unable to sell that idea to the very people that it was designed to benefit, the workers. Because what happened at the end was members of Congress, most publicly Senator Brown of Ohio, but he was not the only one by any means, stepped up and said, this is not, Pillar 1 is not going to help the workers, and we're not going to support it. And the result of that was that the administration backed down. And I think that I'm gloomy about the future just on Pillar 1. Anyway, I'll get to the other pillars in a minute. The discussions are continuing, and I have no doubt they will continue. I think they're going to be virtual in the short run, but I don't see an outcome of any significance. This is an election year. The whole thing is already under attack by the Republican frontrunner. I think that it's going to be unlikely that the administration is going to try to bring Pillar 1 to conclusion before the election. So you're going to have a lot of talk and not a lot of action. Will it ultimately produce something? I think that depends on the outcome of the election. Obviously, if Trump is the nominee and he wins, then no, he's already said that he'll get rid of it. If Biden wins, if Biden's the nominee and he wins, then I can see them bringing the thing to a conclusion in 2025. But I don't see anything in the short run. This is a disappointment. It also has another irony, because if you think about what a trade policy for the workers has turned out to mean, it really has turned out to be not very different from past policies, in the sense that it's designed to help essentially old manufacturing, steel, aluminum, automobiles. So what we have is a 21st century policy, a new paradigm being produced by a president who is pretty firmly anchored in the 20th century and not the 21st century, and still looking, for one of my favorite country and western songs, he and Trump both are lost in the 50s tonight, and they're trying to bring back industries that are important. There's no question about it. I think you can't be a modern industrial economy without steel and without automobiles. But that's not really the future. The U.S. economy is about 75% services now. With the explosion of digitization in the economy, and now AI, it's going to be even more than that going forward. I was excited about Pillar 1 because it had in it the potential for digital rulemaking, which we've seen other countries already going. Marc mentioned the digital, the DEFA, and the ASEAN is pursuing. There are also other DIPA among Singapore and I think New Zealand and Chile. You've got the Japanese initiative, Digital Free Flow with Trust. You've got the Europeans ahead of everybody else from a regulatory standpoint. And you've really got the United States sort of just watching. And I was hoping for Pillar 1 to be an advance in probably the most important growth area for our economy. And we really folded on that. And it's a great disappointment. I think we also made a durability mistake. Aaron mentioned durability in the beginning, and I'll say a word about that. I think there's been a lot of frustration in Congress about IPEF generally. Part of it is driven by members who don't think it helps workers, and I think that's what did Pillar 1 in. But there's a lot of other grumpy members of Congress too, and that is basically because they feel cut out of the process. And for them, being cut out of the process is, I've watched a lot of trade agreements over a long period of time. There's never been a single one where Congress was happy with the degree of consultation that they had. Never. And there's some truth to the fact that there's an inevitable difference between the branches of government and on what that means. Congress consultation means the administration comes up and says, we don't know what to do. Tell us what to do. For executive branch, consultation means we'll give you a 2-hour advance notice on the press release. So there's a big gap there. But from a durability perspective, you want to have trade agreements that Congress has approved. Because if Congress has approved them, then they end up in law, in the implementing bill, and that makes them much more difficult to get rid of. When Trump says, you know, first thing I'm going to do, or the second thing I'm going to do when I win is get rid of it, people in the other countries are going to take that seriously because he can, because it has no legislative statutory permanence. And the administration made an early decision not to try to do that. And I can understand the politics of why they did it, but I think it's a mistake, and it's a mistake on 2 grounds. One, it raises the very durability issue I'm discussing. It also signals the other parties that the United States doesn't intend to make any major concessions. Because if we were going to make a major concession, we would need congressional approval. Now, having taken market access off the table, having taken other things off the table, we're not making concessions. So the administration, I think, is right in saying they don't have to send it to Congress. But what they're really telling the other governments is don't expect much from us on this. And so I'm gloomy about the future. So what are we left with? We're left with the other 3 pillars. And I think Barbara and Marc did a very good job of talking about what's in them. And I don't want to downplay that. What's in them can be important. The only text we have is Pillar 2. And I think there, you know, the trade facilitation provisions there that Barbara alluded to, and the supply chain resilience related issues, particularly crisis management, can be very important. And the issue for 2024 is going to be implementation. You know, can we stand up those the structure, the 3 party, the parties, committees that have been created? Can we turn them into meaningful, action-oriented bodies that are going to actually produce something? Too soon to say. I think the will is there, and I think with Secretary Raimondo, you've got someone who's certainly capable of doing that. I mean, she brought the 3 pillars into conclusion. And I think now she's going to be focused on making them meaningful, because, you know, the reality is cabinet officials get judged by what they finish, not by what they start. And one of her major trade accomplishments will be if she can turn particularly Pillar 2 into a meaningful exercise that provides greater supply chain resilience, particularly for US companies that are facing not only Chinese economic coercion, but, you know, climate change crises, monsoons, floods, earthquakes, things that interrupt supply chains and cause choke point failure. I think the decarbonization elements of Pillar 3, and Marc alluded to this, also have promise. I think when this all began, and the Scholl Chair and Matt Goodman's economic program were writing early papers about what all this could mean, we asked the administration, you know, where are the tangible benefits? You know, if market access is off the table, what are you offering? And it took them about a month to answer that question. And their answer in the end was money. And I'll go back to Erin, turn it back to Erin on that when I'm done, because she has experience with the Development Finance Corporation, which is a repository of at least some money. And we should spend a little bit of time talking about that, because particularly on Pillar 3, if you're going to assist the other countries with their energy transition, that's expensive. And they don't have the money. We're not the only country that is prepared to chip in, but it would be good to have a discussion about how the United States is going to structure that, and whether in fact they're going to come up with anything. So I'm a little bit gloomy about that because all those cards have not been laid on the table. I would hope in 2024, Pillar 2 gets implemented, you know, and Secretary Raimondo takes the win, that we get Pillars 3 and 4 signed, sealed, delivered, and we get implementation started. I think on Pillar 1, it's going to waddle off into the sunset with lots of meetings and lots of discussion, and no concrete outcomes until at least after the election. And with that, I turn it back to Erin.
Always ending on a happy note, but Bill, you make a good point on the money. Where is the money? It's been infrastructure week for about 8 years now, and a lot of that gets to how are we going to fund this? And working at the DFC, decarbonization and climate was definitely one of the early priorities during the Biden administration, that 1/3 of its portfolio was going to finance climate-related infrastructure and investments. There's been big investments. One was a $500 million investment in a first solar manufacturing plant in India. But these are all slow in coming to go from concept to contract, especially on major projects that may or may not be commercially viable, which is what DFC is supposed to do, is not fast. And it's not going to happen this year. Additionally, I think a lot of these efforts rely on mobilizing private sector capital. But if you are working in risky markets, there's only so much you can do to de-risk these markets to mobilize companies like US companies. I don't know if they're really ready and willing and able to go jump into an Indonesian project on decarbonization so quickly. So, I mean, these are things that we definitely have to think of. But money is a big problem. You also have the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, which is the G7 initiative, which also has climate as one of its major planks. And the US is supposed to dump in $200 billion. I don't know where that's coming from, but it should be great. But yeah, these are big questions. But Bill, I'm glad that you talked about the congressional aspect of this. We hear that members of Congress are supportive of something like IPEF, but don't know how to come up with their own thing. You're right in that Congress never feels that it's been properly consulted. But I do have questions of how much consultations did happen. There were complaints at the very beginning. It didn't seem like that was remedied at all. But Congress has been able to do trade-like agreements. It did pass a 21st century agreement between Taiwan and US. IPEF may be too big, but there is no durability without a congressional aspect of this. So just a reminder to the audience, please put in questions into the Q&A box. And since we have about 15 minutes left, I will relinquish my tyrannical moderator role and not ask all the questions and turn it over to our audience. So the first question we get from Garrett Barnacote, who is asking, what are the most beneficial areas that IPEF countries can do to facilitate greater investment in diversified clean energy supply chains, in addition to facilitating long-term offtake agreements for critical minerals? Barbara, Mark, don't know if you want to take this on first, or Bill, if you have any comments.
I'd make a general comment, but I think Mark is more in touch with the American business community right now than I am. I ran the National Foreign Trade Council for 15 years, which means I represented large multinational companies who would be some of the target investors here. And I think what I learned from there is general. It's not IPEF specific. It's not critical mineral specific. And I think what investors look for is rule of law, stability, and policy certainty more than anything else. They know that commercial disputes are inevitable, despite the best of intentions. So what they look for are countries that are rule of law countries. So they know there is somewhere in that country a dispute settlement process that is transparent, efficient, and objective. So they can go somewhere if they have a grievance and have some degree of confidence that it will be adjudicated, whether it's in the judicial system or through a arbitration system or whatever. They look for that. They look for some degree of policy and government stability. That doesn't mean that they expect things to never change, but they want to know if the tax rate, what the tax rate is going to be today, and they want to have some reasonable expectation that 5 or 10 years from now it won't be all that different. So they're looking for sort of standard things about how companies operate. Corruption is a big issue for American companies. American companies are significantly constrained on that compared to some of their competitors because of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And I think our own ethos here is to try to avoid corruption. So they look for countries where that's not endemic. None of that has anything to do particularly with IPEF, but I think if you want to start the investment ball rolling more than it has been, countries need to look at those larger issues as well. Now, in IPEF specifically, I'd only say, and then let me turn it back to Marc to talk about what people are actually doing. In the search for supply chain resilience, I think what we're seeing is some migration away from China, either people leaving, or I think more often people identifying Chinese choke points and then simply creating redundant capabilities somewhere else. And that somewhere else is often in Southeast Asia. And in my conversations with Southeast Asian governments, I think all of them are salivating at the prospect of companies engaging in the China plus one strategy. And who's going to be the plus one? Is it going to be Indonesia? Is it going to be the Philippines? Is it going to be Vietnam? Or all of the above. And I think we're going to see more of that. And I think Marc is in a better position than I am to talk about who the winners are going to be.
Marc?
Sure, to chime in, Bill, you correctly noted again, yeah, many of the governments in Southeast Asia, again, they see both the opportunities as well as having to navigate some challenges. I would just offer an interesting anecdote here, because we're certainly seeing, again, the number of ASEAN countries that are globally competitive as these plus one opportunities, or the alternative, so to speak. But interesting enough, some recent IMF research that I came across, because I've been doing some broader research on ASEAN and supply chain evolution in 2024. Interesting enough, as we are noticing alternative to China countries increase sort of their export shares in the United States, and in some ways kind of maybe picking up the slack of the fact that we are seeing some declines in certain imports from China coming to the United States. The IMF research has noted a degree of correlation between some of those same alternative countries increasing their US export market share, are also seeing increased imports from China. So in a sense, this correlation, not to say there's a causal relationship, but definitely this sort of middleman dynamic seems to be one of the initial trends that we are picking up. Countries importing more from China, but also then exporting more to the United States. Not to say that's a one-to-one relationship, but an interesting observation that the IMF has sort of picked up in some of their recent research.
Interesting. Barbara, any comments?
Just to go back to the more specific question, I agree with what Bill and Marc said, but I guess the more specific questions of how the U.S. can really make progress on the clean energy pillar without dealing with tariffs. I mean, I think one or some of the other things you wouldn't typically put in a trade agreement. I mean, I think one would look at this and say, well, the first thing you want to do is eliminate tariffs and non-tariff barriers in environmental goods and services off the table. The second thing so if you're trying to incentivize trade and trade in all directions and the establishment of supply chains, so you would want to do that. And then you'd want to have investment agreements to provide that certainty to companies that Bill was talking about. I'm not sure that that's ever been discussed. It doesn't seem to be on the table, but is there something that comes close to that the governments can take to the line without crossing it, that allows them to begin discussing those kinds of issues that would lower the risk for companies that are looking to invest and also promote trade? I mean, right now what we're talking about is a lot of matchmaking exercises, which are useful, but the rest of the environment for trade and investment needs to be dealt with as well. And I think you'll make some specific deals, as you said, Aaron, and there will be progress based on some of the the financing programs that are in place. But in order to just promote broader trade and investment, I think you have to start dealing with some of these other issues.
Right. One country that we haven't mentioned very specifically, but a handful of times is China. And Mark, you answered a question in the Q&A, but, taking Bill's point on what countries are looking for, transparency, rule of law. But Mark, you're talking about, the trade agreements or the trade figures here. One question that we had was, China's economic prowess, its connections with countries all over the world, including both in trade, but diplomatically as well, and also where its BRI has landed. But how realistic is IPEF as a counter? How can IPEF change these dynamics? And you answered a bit in the chat, which I encourage folks to take a look at, but I think is important to kind of draw out some of the points that you made.
I think it goes to the heart of the matter that, in some ways we're kind of seeing a tension between the continued evolution of trade relations particularly within the Asia-Pacific region, driven by, economic efficiency and profitability and resilience against the growing kind of, national security kinds of concerns, wanting to diversification of partnerships. And we all know, if you're looking at trade through those lens, those value propositions really trump, efficiency and profitability and those kinds of questions. We're saying we got to diversify trade with other partners, even if those other partners aren't nowhere near as efficient or as productive, but we're doing it for national security reasons. I think that contention in terms of how it's playing out in Asia, it's a tough one, because we're certainly seeing these incremental trends of China trade with the rest of Asia, particularly under RCEP, is growing rather rapidly. I think 2022, China's total trade with its fellow RCEP member nations is approaching $2 trillion, which is a significant increase from before RCEP went into force. We're seeing ASEAN-China trade, for example, where they had the two sides had set a goal. They want to reach $1 trillion in two-way trade by 2030. I think they'll definitely reach that $1 trillion per year two-way trade well before 2030, because now they're already north of $700 billion in two-way trade already. And that's, again, before we're talking about even the upgrading of the ASEAN-China FTA to maybe further liberalize trade. So to the degree that IPEF in its current form could really alter or hinder those kind of trends that we're seeing, I don't see that as being very likely at this stage of the game. It can play a role. It can certainly further enhance US-ASEAN trade or US Indo-Pacific trade with partners, but I don't see it being a counter driver to the trends that we're already seeing taking place in the Indo-Pacific region.
Okay, thank you. And just to pick up on another question that we have in here, I think we're all pretty, I don't know, realistic, a little bit down or whatnot on IPEF. But one of these questions is, do you think the U.S. trade policy community, and that includes the business community, I mean, I think it's been clear where CSIS has been on IPEF through the work that we've done, as Bill has mentioned, but do you think that they were fully supportive of IPEF talks at the outset?
I can just speak for our organization. We were supportive primarily because, from the vantage point that it included 7 of the 10 ASEAN member states, we saw it as an opportunity. Even though within our membership, clearly a wide range of concerns from the outset that it's not enough. But in the grand scheme of things, one has to start someplace. And as we all know, as we've said, there's so many other things going on. Whether IPEF does what it does or doesn't do, it still has to compete with all of the other initiatives and frameworks that are not stopping, and no one's kind of waiting for the U.S. to engage.
Thank you.
Can I add?
Yeah, please go ahead.
I agree with Mark, and I think, clearly they saw it as a second best or just a fallback of if this is the only initiative out there, I guess we'll see if we can help shape it. But they certainly thought that something more ambitious was necessary. And I think at the beginning of the administration, there was still, not just among US IPEF partners, but among stakeholders in the United States, or at least some stakeholders in the United States and in the business community, that thought that the administration was looking to make progress on its domestic agenda as a preliminary step to then looking at more traditional trade agreements, and that they would eventually get there after a year or after 2 years. And then it became clear after the initiative was underway that that was not, in fact, the goal, and that they were going to stick to the approach that they had taken. And I think that that is not exactly what people thought the outcome was going to be.
Mm-hmm. Bill, I'm going to turn this question over to you. What do you anticipate will be the outcome of Secretary Raimondo's trip to Philippines and Thailand in March, two of our treaty allies, in fact? Do you think she'll use this as a way to advance IPEF goals?
Is that one's for me?
If you want to take it, I can turn it over to others.
Well, I think yes, it's going to be an effort to advance IPEF goals, no question. I hope that she will also treat it as a bit of a trade mission. One of the peculiarities of the administration so far, which I don't understand, and I talked to somebody who was in the administration and he couldn't explain it either. They don't seem very interested in exports. I mean, they're not against them, but they don't seem very interested in really promoting them. I mean, if you think back to previous administrations of both parties, trade missions were a big deal. The Secretary of Commerce gets a plane that says United States of America and takes 30 or 40 executives someplace. And I mean, during my tenure, the Secretary Brown died doing that in Croatia. But it was a big deal. And it was a big deal partly because all these deals, of course, had been negotiated separately in advance. But what a trade mission does is it provides closure. It's an opportunity for a signing ceremony, pictures, CEOs get to meet, cabinet ministers in other countries. It's a way to, tie everything up with a ribbon and a bow and say, we, this company, and we, the United States, are here, and it's a meaningful exercise. And these guys are not doing that. And I hope she does. When she went to China, one of the questions that I got from various private sector people was, is she taking anybody with her? Last August, is she taking any companies with her? And I asked the question, and the answer was very clearly no. Nobody's going. And I hope that when she does the next few trips, that she takes some companies along. If the goal here, and I think the goal was, going back even to TPP, the goal has never been primarily economic. The goal has always been, I think, to demonstrate the U.S. commitment to the region, and that the U.S. is there to stay, and that the U.S. understands that committing itself to the region it has to mean more than just sending an aircraft carrier through the South China Sea every other month. It requires an economic commitment, and TPP was intended to be that. IPEF, I think we all agreed, is a poor substitute, but it was also intended to be that. And I think she needs to not just wave the flag; she needs to bring a lot of other companies along with her to wave the flag. I have no idea if that's the plan, but I hope that's where this goes, and I hope that one of the tangible outcomes of this is a lot of deals. Mark, you may have a better idea of what's going on.
Well, that's usually what we hope with trade missions, that deals and companies go. We are at time. I see that Mark has been diligently answering the questions and the Q&A, so thank you very much for that. But first of all, thank you to the audience for joining us today. We've had a good turnout. Glad to see that there's some people that are still interested to see what IPEF can do. This is going to be a rocky year, certainly interesting. I really want to thank my panelists for joining me today and providing their insights and their time. Barbara, Mark, and Bill, thank you so much for joining us. And then finally, a big thank you to Kupang, who has been generously supporting our work on IPEF. We also had a conference in Taiwan last October talking about Taiwan's role in regional trade. Of course, Taiwan is going to be on top of many people's mind, so that is online as well. We have a lot of good work on IPEF and trade, and whether or not this is going forward. Bill has his own column, and please keep an eye out for what Barbara and Mark are doing this year. So once again, thank you. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see where IPEF goes from here. Thank you.